Hi, this is Michael Kaufman from the Clio Awards, and you're listening to Your Morning Coffee, my favorite podcast, with my pals Jay Gilbert and Mike Etchart. Weekly music news for the new music business.
From Trapital, the future of music business with Economist Will Page.
From Music Business Worldwide, Amy Thomson, how I'd fix the music industry in 3 easy steps.
And another from Trapital, why your followers aren't fans of your music. Ooh. Well, we are going deep, Jay. It's going to be a fun episode. Lots of great stuff to talk about. So here we go.
Stand by for transmission.
This is London calling.
Wake up! The revolution is at hand!
Your morning coffee is on the air. On the air. On the air. On the air. On the air.
Standing by.
Your morning coffee, the weekly music news for the new music business. It's the highly curated, agitated, advocated, moderated, and liberated digital music information that you need to know. We are your digital music authority. And now from our studios in Hollywood, California, here's your hosts, Jay Gilbert and Mike Etchart.
At top of the morning to you, Jay. Good to see you on a lovely, warm Saturday morning here
Good
in
to
Southern
see you too,
California.
my friend.
Yeah, we've got some really interesting things to talk about today, and it's been a fun week because we've a lot of neat notes and interesting things coming through from folks on our little special edition with Mercuriadis, and it's nice to hear. We really appreciate when people do reach out to us and comment, and we've got a lot of comments, and it's it was a fun one to do, wasn't it?
It really was, and I loved all the reshares. I loved all the comments. All the personal notes that were sent over, and it was just such an amazing conversation with him. And like we said on the bonus episode, if you haven't listened to it, we talked for a little bit before we hit record, and Merc is like we are. He's a music freak. He's got a record collection, and we were even joking around that the next time we get together, we want to hang out and see the music collection.
Yeah, absolutely.
So
but
good.
Boy, it's and I think like we've mentioned before, we are talking specifically about him frequently, or that the things that he kind of has created and put into motion almost every episode. And so it was a real treat to actually chat him up, and we are all roughly the same age, and so it's the same kind of sort of cultural things that shaped us early on in our careers, and he's a mover and a shaker.
Yeah, super smart guy.
A super bright guy, and we'll go on and on and on, and that's what you want when you interview folks, is to have them go deep on topics, and he's very entertaining, very funny, and passionate about music, and he had one of those, he was pointing to us, he's trying to show us things, but he had one of those backgrounds when you're on Zoom where you can't really see behind him, but he's got a super, super deep interest and knowledge in music, and a real broad palette of stuff he listens to, and that's what you want. That's what you want that guy to be.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about a couple of other really smart people that you and I talk about frequently today on the podcast. One of them is Will Page, and we'll get into that in a second, and the other is Dan Runcie, a couple of our favorite music people that we follow closely and talk about closely.
But sharp, and that was one of the things that I was asking Merc about was, it's one thing to be a big music fan, but then he puts on his hat where he's dealing with institutional investors. Okay, that's like an entirely different language.
That's a different skill set, right? Yeah.
Totally. And that's, we're going to talk about a couple of articles that are on Trapital, and that's Dan Runcie. Same thing. It's like, yeah, he can talk about music all day long, real deep knowledge, and his sort of focus is hip hop. And then it's like, oh yeah, but let me just go now. Going to talk about economics and business, and it's like, whoa, dude,
yeah,
multiple skills here.
Yeah, he'll go deep on the music, and if you go to LinkedIn and look at his page, it spells it out pretty simply. He says that he's the founder of Trapital, a media company that covers hip hop business and strategy. Trapital assesses the deals, companies, and artists that shape the culture. Trapital's audience includes thousands of music executives, media moguls, and venture capitalists. And, I subscribe to his newsletter. We talk about it on this show. We post a lot of his, his articles in your morning coffee. And today we're going to cover two really, really important stories that Dan wrote.
Yeah. Absolutely. So looking forward to it, to say the least. And by the way, I get to talk to the groovy dude that I am talking to right now, my good friend Jay Gilbert. He is the co-founder of music marketing and strategy company Label Logic. He's the curator of the Your Morning Coffee newsletter, which informs everything we do here on the podcast. And he's a former executive with Universal, Sony, and Warner Music Groups, also Fox Home Entertainment. And just a groovy guy that is always fighting for his right.
Thank you.
Party.
I appreciate that, and the check's in the mail. My co-host here is longtime host of Sound and Vision Radio, Mike Etchart, formerly of SST Records, Warner Music, Capital EMI, and Universal Music, and the guy that introduced me to high-res audio, Dolby Atmos in particular. And we're going to be going in the studio pretty soon and taking our buddy from Apple and maybe even another friend up to listen to some of those Dolby Atmos mixes, which are just breathtaking.
Yes. We're going to go to Greg Penny's studio, and our friend Greg Penny is over in the UK right now as we speak, I believe, working on some stuff. So looking forward to that. And of course, Jay, we get to do this every week, and we have wonderful support from our groovy sponsors.
Yeah.
I will let you start the big thanks.
Yeah, a big thank you to the Music Business Association. It's a 4-day Music Biz 2022 conference, and the agenda has just been announced, and it's taking place May 9th through 12th at the JW Marriott in Nashville, along with returning favorites like the Metadata Summit, Next Gen Now, DSP workshops, and the Brand Summit, which this year include presentations by Pepsi, MasterCard, and the NFL. You'll find timely new additions for 2022, including conversations on NFTs, gaming, immersive music experiences, catalog acquisitions, and much, much more. Visit musicbiz.org for more, and I will see you there.
And hopefully beating the humidity before the humidity gets there. Fingers crossed.
Yeah.
And we are also sponsored by Hypebot. Since 2004, Hypebot has chronicled the new music industry and the trends and technologies that are changing how music is discovered, consumed, marketed, and monetized. It is edited daily by founder Bruce Houghton with help from Alana Bonilla. Hypebot and sister blog Music Think Tank are published by live music discovery and marketing platform Bands in Town. And yes, Bands in Town, over 65 million live music fans trust Bands in Town to get personalized concert alerts, recommendations, and messages from their favorite artists. It is the #1 artist service platform connecting over 550,000 artists with their superfans. Managers, labels, agencies, and artists access their own dashboard to manage and promote their tour dates across all platforms. Big thanks, Music Business Association, Hypebot, Bands in Town. Big thanks.
Speaking of thanks, let's thank our good friend Michael Kaufman for that cool intro.
Oh yeah.
Michael is an old friend of ours, executive director of Clio Music, currently. The 2022 Clio Music Awards are coming up, hosted by Yola. It'll be Tuesday, May 10th at that Music Biz conference that we just referred to. I'll be there. Should be a lot of fun.
Oh, and
Thank you,
Yola,
Michael.
by the way. Yes, absolutely. Big thanks. Well, Jay, let us put our floaties on and jump into the pool. What do you say?
Let's do it. This first one is a story, and it's really a podcast that they transcribed. And it's, as you mentioned, it's the Trapital podcast, Dan Runce's podcast. Just a fantastic interview with Will Page. And if you don't know who Will Page is, he wrote this really amazing book called Tarzan Economics. I've started reading some of his pieces online. One was called Twitch's Rockonomics that you and I covered. And after that, I reached out via a mutual friend and had a really cool conversation with Will and found out quickly just how funny, smart he is, such a great music fan. And I've heard him interviewed before. In fact, I interviewed him on my other podcast, Music Biz Weekly, episode number 475, but not to the level that Dan Runce can do it. So you can listen to the podcast, and we have a link there, or you can see the transcription if you like to read. The intro says, one of the most unique insights into the state of the music business today doesn't come from a record label exec, not from an agent, not from an artist. No, it comes from Scottish economist Will Page, who served that role for Spotify from 2012 to 2019. And that was a period of explosive growth for Spotify. But if you ask Will Page about streaming's future, he's not nearly as optimistic as the rest of the industry. Quote, the party has to come to an end. Unquote.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it starts by saying, this is talking about kind of a hook that grabs you. He says he believes the music industry is transitioning from an herbivore market to a carnivore one. And to clarify, he says, in other words, future growth will not come from brand new customers. It'll come from the streaming services eating into each other's market share. Not only has subscriber counts possibly tapped out, in his opinion, but streaming services have also put a ceiling on revenues by charging only $9.99, a price that hasn't budged in 20 years despite giant leaps in technology and music catalog size. Very interesting thing. And what I thought of immediately was, remember when Apple, not too long ago, announced, because there was talk about adding different tiers for streaming and charging more for immersive mixes and for high-resolution audio. And then Apple comes out and says, no, we're going to include all of that for free into our regular subscription price.
Right.
And that, I'm sure, was a shot over the bow at both Amazon and Spotify. And so, that's the first thing I thought of when he said that. But it's a fascinating kind of take on what's going on. And we talk a lot about how the fact that, you look at Netflix and all of the streaming movie television services, they are not shy about raising their prices at all, and yet we are still at $9.99, a killer deal.
Yeah,
and it should be more.
Yeah, I think it really should be. And we talk about this quite a bit on this podcast, and we report on these stories where Amazon, they were one of the first to have high res audio added without an extra fee. There are some really cool high-res audio platforms out there like Qobuz, if you're into that thing. But you're right. There was a missed opportunity there. I think it's grossly undervalued, and that ties into the whole ecosystem. How much, as Merck points out, how unfairly songwriters are being paid currently. There's a finite pie that we need to slice up. And there's such great value. And as you mentioned, some of these other streaming services on the TV and movie side, they've raised their rates, and there's a certain value there. The difference, I think, is that on the TV side, they're very different offerings, whereas on the music side, they're pretty similar. I think Dan had mentioned in this article, it's like 80% the same across the board on all these streaming services. So it's definitely something we need to we look at going forward.
And I don't think there'd be a lot of pushback for an increase in price. I think on the film and TV side, and we actually Netflix numbers came out this week, and they were pretty not great. And so
they lost,
but I think
a bunch of subscribers. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. But I think in it's kind of like it's two different universes. Everybody wants to have a music service, and that will not change. The other services, for at least in my house, and I'm sure for most people, you start to assess. It's like, okay, what do I do? Am I going to need HBO for the next couple of months? Well, maybe I'll cancel that, and maybe I'll jump back in. People are jumping back in and out because there's so many choices now. And you can't have them all.
Yeah, and I wonder how much the lockdown had to do with a lot of their growth.
Sure.
For
I
people
think a lot.
trapped at home, and they subscribe to these things, and then maybe when they're back, kind of coming back to that new abnormal and they're commuting again, things are a little bit different. And of course, that plays right into the hands of audio streaming if you have any type of commute, if you like to listen to music at work and are allowed to do that. So there you go.
Yeah, you're not going to give music up, I don't think. And I think I don't think there's going to be a tremendous pushback if they raised to $12.99 or whatever the number is. It seems very reasonable.
I think I'd give up. I'd give up groceries before I would give up my my music.
I think so.
And there's this really great story, and I'm going to butcher it, that my business partner Jeff Moscow alludes to back in the early days of Motown. And Jeff, forgive me because I know I'm going to get this wrong, but the gist of it is that they'd have these meetings, and it wasn't just the executives there. They would bring in the secretaries and the people who cleaned up and just anybody in the building to basically vote on which songs should be singles. And the line was something to the effect of, if you only had $1, are you going to get the hot dog or are you going to buy this single? Right. And the answer had to be, I'm going to buy this single. Right.
Yeah.
So another part of this that I think is really interesting is, Dan asked him about the IFPI report. And as you know, there's the RIAA, which is U.S., and then the IFPI report is basically global. And it's just this amazing report that lists, it's like a report card on the music industry globally on every aspect. So he alludes to this, and Dan asked him, what were some of the things that stuck out to you? And Will said, I'll give you a couple. The first one is the global business. Last time I looked, I think there's 208 countries in the world. The global yearbook that we're discussing here, I think, has 58. So we're calling it the global music industry, but it's 58 out of those 208 countries. And I hadn't looked at it like that. And he says it's also becoming more quote unquote American. When Spotify launched, Americans made 20 to 23% of the music business. Today it's 37%. And then he said kind of the second thing is, the vinyl recovery. And I love this line. He says it's defying the laws of gravity. Will has all these great lines, and that's one I'm going to steal. We're now looking at vinyl being worth about $500 million, which is more than it's been worth in the past 30 years. It's worth more than CDs, cassettes, and downloads, the three formats that were supposed to declare that vinyl is dead, right? On the consumer side, he says he saw a survey that suggested that a majority, over half of all vinyl buyers, don't own a record player. And I had heard something like that before, and I find that fascinating, that they're still streaming the music, but they want to have that vinyl up on their wall. I mean, he talks about how some people frame it, and the frame costs more than the vinyl does. But, he breaks up that kind of the economics there, that if there's an album that has 10 songs on it and 3 of them are just awesome, that's a whole different equation, because in the streaming world, it's different than, let's say, the vinyl or CD world, because you're only streaming those killer tracks. And I hadn't really thought of that. It's a whole different experience. When you see the sale of a CD or vinyl, you count it. Okay, there were 1 million of these sold. But that doesn't tell you about consumption. If I'm just making this up based on his remark there, let's say 500,000 of those are just ending up on people's shelves to show how cool they are. Well, they bought the thing, but they're not listening to it over and over. Maybe they're listening on streaming or something else.
Yeah. It's fascinating, and can that be sustained? And I just don't know. At least for the vinyl thing, there's not really something like you can kind of refer to that would give you a glimpse into the future. That sort of thing, technology wise, and it's just everything. It's so unique.
Yeah.
What has happened with vinyl?
Yeah.
And I cannot predict what's going to happen. Will it continue? I mean, I don't think it can continue at this pace.
Well,
but
we don't have the capacity yet to even fulfill the rate, that it's at right now. I was talking to Terry Courier from Music Millennium, and he was talking about these big orders that he places for vinyl, and he gets, 10% of the order. So we're not to the point where we even know where that's going. And one thing I learned from not just, Will Page, but, we talked a little bit about that podcast, Freakonomics. I just love economics in general. And the thing that I learned about economics is it's not necessarily always about money. It's more about human behavior, about incentives.
Psychology.
Yeah,
sociology.
psychology. Exactly.
Absolutely.
Why do we do the things that we do?
Yeah.
Seth Godin has this great line, people like us do things like this. People like us do things like this. So you think about Kiss fans or Jimmy Buffett parrot heads or deadheads or whatever. That's part of a community because people like us do things like this. And you had touched on something that I just thought was brilliant about, the herbivores versus carnivores, line at the beginning.
Oh, yeah.
And he said, in America, we've had herbivores, we've had Spotify growing, Apple growing, Amazon growing, YouTube growing. Everybody's reporting growth, even Pandora. But we're going to see at some point that, Apple will grow by eating into Spotify, or YouTube will grow by eating into Amazon's growth. So the key question you have to ask is, when do we go from this herbivore market to that carnivore market? Super fascinating stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And whenever you you look at those names that he was talking about, Apple grows by eating Spotify, and then YouTube, et cetera. Don't forget, out of those companies we're talking about, Apple, Spotify, YouTube, Amazon, Spotify just sticks out like a sore thumb because this is all they do, and those other carnivores, let's call them, Apple, YouTube, Amazon, they all have lots of other
It's not their
businesses to
core
lean back
business,
on.
right?
It's not their core business, and they can be aggressive. They can be predatory.
They can take chances.
And they can take chances, and they've just got a lot more wiggle room with which to be aggressive.
Yeah.
And what does that mean? I don't know what that means, but I just know that when I see those four companies mentioned, that to me continues to pop into my head.
Yeah, I said they could take chances, but they really don't. It's Spotify who's taking the chances. It's Spotify who's out innovating everybody else, in my mind, with all of the things that they do and all of the access that I have as a music marketer or my artists have to go into Spotify for artists. And yes, there's Amazon Music for artists and there's Apple Music for artists, etc. But none of them have all of the options that I have with Spotify. I can change that banner. I can change the artist image. I can put social links up there. I can put 140 images there. I can put a personal message, bio. There's so many things that I can do. And I think they're talking about competing on price. Dan makes a really good point here. But before I read that point that he made, I think that the competition really has to move away from price, so they're not eating into each other's market share on price, that it's more a competition on some of those things that I just mentioned, those innovations and access and making it a community. I think there's a missed opportunity here of having the DSP, regardless of who it is, be that community, be that place where you have control, almost like it's your website that you can. I know they've partnered with Shopify for merch, and they're doing some really cool things, and we're headed in that direction. But I think we're just scratching the surface. Dan points out that shifting to that carnivore mentality, is really because roughly 80% of the content they offer, is the same across the platforms. And he says that it's, it could be more of a price war, in video streaming. Most of them have different content. And I think that's really important.
Yeah, and he says, I think we're in peak subscriber territory, where at some point soon we're going to start seeing growth happen through stealing other customers as opposed to finding your own. Again, that's kind of what we kind of started with. And he says, so I just want to put that warning flag out there now. We're partying like it's 1989, fine. But at some point, the party has to come to an end, and growth is going to come at the expense of other players that then flips, that then kind of changes the way everything is going in the market. And he talks about oil and peak oil, and when once you've extracted more oil that's in the ground, everything starts getting more expensive, and that's we're kind of in that territory now. And it makes sense to me, it totally makes sense to me. There's, and I think somewhere else in the article he mentions that, yes, there's whatever the number is, 110 million subscribers at the moment in the country of 320 million. But that doesn't mean that there's 220 million left that are going to subscribe. There's just a ton of people that will never subscribe. So what is the number of maximum subscribers you have in a given country, in a given territory? Maybe we're there or approaching there now here.
Yeah.
I don't know. But if that's the case, it's not, you don't have this gigantic runway of more customers still coming.
Yeah.
Which is sometimes with the assumption that that's the case.
Yeah. So that's streaming. He also talked about the live business. And he pointed out something that I thought was really interesting. He said that he was noticing that the industry was changing, and he talks about specifically in the UK, between like 2012, the year of the London Olympics, and 2019. He said the live music industry in the UK had exploded, and but the growth was lopsided. All the growth came from stadiums, festivals, and to a lesser extent, arenas. The theaters, the 2,000, 3,000 capacity theaters like the Fillmore West. Those were actually shrinking in size. So we had this lopsided live music industry, which is going in the right direction, towards the head as opposed to the long tail, the stadiums and the festivals, the arena as opposed to the theater, as the clubs, university venues. So that's the live music market. And he said the breadwinner for most artists, I think it makes up about 70% of what artists, live on, comes from the road, and a lot of it's vanished. And his point was, how do we get that back? Now, clearly the pandemic has just devastated, the music industry, and it is crawling back. I'd read this article in Rolling Stone about how South by Southwest, a lot of those events and shows was like a super spreader event, and there were some spikes again. So we're not out of the woods completely yet, but we're certainly, on the right track.
And I wonder if the shine on festivals is really kind of waning.
I don't know. I read an article the other day that said it's not waning. But I would like to have you complete that thought. But I wanted to there was one last note here, and it was about festivals. It said, with festivals, the costs are all taken care of by the festival, but your heart says what does that you do, intimate relationships with your fans, right? In other words, you're staring at 50,000 strangers in a muddy field. That's different from staring at 2,000 friends at the Fillmore West.
Absolutely. No, I love that line. Exactly. But we're talking about festivals, of course, and right in Coachella season here in Southern California. And the LA Times did an interesting article. It was kind of a pictorial of what it looks like at Coachella just for the general public. Now, of course, you hear about all these VIP packages and all of that stuff.
Right.
And great. If you're going to spend several $1,000s, I'm sure your Coachella experience is going to be great. However,
better be. If
you are just the great unwashed, like I would be going to Coachella, where you're going to walk in and whatever the tickets are costing, there's a lack of seating, there's a lack of shade, everything is freaking expensive. It's a pretty crappy experience. Now, I'm not 22 anymore,
That's
so
exactly
I'm saying
right.
this from a guy who's a little bit older, but still, I think even my kids, when I've kind of with talking to them about this, it's like, yeah, that doesn't seem like a fun thing to do. It's like the experience of the kind of the more general populace that goes to these festivals is really kind of a crappy experience. And at some point, is there a pushback on it? And yet it's still expensive.
Yeah. And I guess you're right. It depends who you ask. If it's somebody who's getting the VIP treatment and has, really great food, it's like, when you go to a sporting event and you're in one of the boxes and you've got the sushi there and a nice comfortable leather couch and, all of that, as opposed to sitting, next to a guy screaming for the opposing team. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I don't go to a lot of festivals. I'm just so spoiled. I like to sit and relax and hear the music and see the show and that sort of thing. But I've certainly been to my fair share of them, for work. And they're exhausting. It's like an all day thing, and they're meet and greets, and they're just trying to get to the bathroom or get food, and the water, the price of a bottle of water, things like that.
Yeah, it's insane. Yeah. And so I that's just kind of what I was, as he's talking about festivals and stuff like that in this article, and then I'm thinking of that article the LA Times did about the realities of Coachella right now, what it's really like, and it's not great if you're just, if you're a celebrity. Of course, it's a fabulous event and wonderful.
Or maybe to your point, if you're a kid and you haven't been to a lot of shows, and you in one fell swoop you can see a whole day's worth of just great artists. And but for someone who maybe is a little older, maybe it's not the best experience if you're not doing the VIP thing. To shift gears just really quickly over to publishing, we don't have to talk about this a lot, but I just thought this was really charming. Will was saying that the way that labels and publishing were taught to him, is from his Aunt Doreen Lauder, and she worked at Decca Records, and there's a great story. You need to listen to the podcast, but he said, this is how the music industry works. The record label piece, of that publishing, that's your drugs. And I'm sorry, the record industry is the drugs and the publishing is your pension. I'm totally butchering that, but you get what he's saying. He said, labels went from boom time with CDs to bust with piracy, and now they're booming again with streaming. And I tell people all the time, that's where the revenue is. For the middle class and developing artists, you're not going to make a ton of revenue from sales streams and downloads. You're going to get that from things like publishing, sync licensing, touring, merch, those types of things. Maybe even some of them. I have a couple of artists who are doing pretty well with like stems and beats, but that ecosystem, there's a lot more ways to make revenue. But you need to pay attention to publishing, like we talked about with Merck, and your story about Bob Dylan. It's so important to make sure that that's on your radar.
Right, and as Merck has pointed out, the publishing world has changed once the major recorded music companies controlled or bought into them, and so they're really still getting sort of short shrift on a lot of these deals, and. Well, not sort of, they are. Yeah. And that's, go back and listen to that special if our special
it's so
episode
good.
if you're not familiar with that, and hear him explain it. And so true. But that's a good way of thinking about it. It's your pension, you know, and we used to refer to it as a business of pennies, whereas
mailbox money.
Mailbox money, exactly. But boy, it is certainly, as Merck would say, it is the really the tent poles that hold up the tent. The
absolutely. And I want to make sure, we could talk all day about this, but there's a couple of other things that I want to make sure that you and I touch on. One is kind of the tip jar or the name your own price model, which he talks about, which I think is really interesting. And the other is kind of that KISS promotion, which I thought was brilliant. But just really quickly, he talks about, Epic Games being acquired by Bandcamp. And as he starts talking about Radiohead, and you'll remember years back, they had this kind of voluntary price, this tip jar model, and what he found is, if you put your album out on Bandcamp, for example, and it could be a vinyl record, remember that people are paying to stream it. Also, those people that buy the vinyl. So if you put an album out on Bandcamp and you name your own price, no minimum, but there's a guidance of like, let's say $10, the average price that people pay is $14, that 40% increase. And I find that human behavior, that economics is really interesting, that instead of saying this vinyl is, $20, you say, we'd like it to be around $20, but those super fans, they may pay you $30 for that. And they found it all washed out in the cycle, in that you would make more money by letting the consumer name their own price.
That makes me nervous thinking about that because
it's not for everyone.
It's not for everyone. Yeah, that's a.
I'd like to do an experiment with it, and just, maybe it's not going to work for Beyonce, but it might work for a developing artist.
Yes. Yes.
We'll talk about that KISS thing next, but there was just one line in here that really jumped out at me, and I highlighted it. He was recently at South by Southwest, and he said it was the first time he went to South by Southwest, this is Will Page, where no one asked him about the band he saw last night. Everybody asked me what VR headset that I tried.
Yeah, Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. You just kind of go, really? But that's part of what South by Southwest has turned into, for sure. But it's still depressing. That's old guy talking when I say that, which is it's probably true. But yeah. But I was really surprised to see that. Then we talked about this with Merck too. Merck was a big Kiss fan as a young man. We were both Kiss fans as still Kiss fans. But to see him, he's Scottish. I guess they were huge all over the world, of course. But to read that he was a big Kiss fan.
I think it's because we're kind of that same age group. And at the time, there was just nothing like them. But let's talk about that promotion where he talks about, I believe it was like 1975, and he likens this to kind of like the first NFT and how far ahead of their time, Kiss were. And if you haven't heard the story, Kiss had a contest where back then you couldn't see them without makeup. They were never photographed without makeup, at least not anything published. And so there was this mystery behind it, and it was part of their mystique. Anyway, long story short, they did a promotion where you could get a photograph of Kiss without makeup, and there were 5 lucky winners. And you got this package in the mail, this envelope that you had to open with scissors. And when you opened it up, there was a photograph of Kiss without makeup, and then it would go black. It was almost like a Bansky display or something. And those who know photography know that if you develop a print, but you don't put it into the fixer, when it's exposed to light, it turns black. And they sent these out. So you got to see them without makeup, for a moment, and then it disappeared.
Such a great, and folks in that camp. I would love to know who thought of that, whose idea that was. It's probably Gene's idea, I would imagine. But it's such a, especially when you think of the times. It's what a great idea, what a great concept, and what a clever way of spinning it. And I'm just stoked that the Economist Will Page knew that story too, which is great.
Yeah,
what I find really interesting about the entire conversation, and like Jay was saying, you really got to go back and either read it or listen to it. But it's, he is so sharp. And when you bring these, and as you mentioned, economics is part business analysis, part psychological analysis, part sociological analysis. It's a really interesting mix of all those things. And to hear his take on that coming from that education and that background and apply it to music and music consumption and streaming and all of these things, it's really, really interesting.
Yeah, I highly recommend it.
Well worth the time.
I highly recommend his book too, Tarzan Economics. It's amazing. And if you Google Twitch's Rockonomics, we raved about that on this podcast, and I'll just leave this story with this thought. Dan had asked him this really intelligent question, and Will's response before he got into the answer was, "Wow, those comments are deeper than Loch Ness."
That's right, from a Scotsman, yes, exactly.
So good.
What more could you say?
Yeah,
great piece, and again, Dan over at Trapital, what a great interview. And Dan is
respect.
Dan was keeping right up with him, so that's a pretty damn good thing to do when you're talking to Will Page. So.
Yeah. All
right, on to the next one, Jay. This is from Music Business Worldwide. Amy Thomson, how I'd fix the music industry in 3 easy steps. And what I found interesting was I would not have guessed those 3 easy steps, having just seen the headline.
Yeah.
And it's a really interesting article. She's, by the way, the chief catalog officer at Hypnosis. Mm-hmm. And, of course, we spoke with Merck.
Yep.
And so she talked about, and actually, who wrote the article? It was...
it's Tim Ingham. It's actually from a podcast. So it's...
Oh, that's right.
That Tim Ingham did for Music Business Worldwide. And just so you know, Amy, first of all, I loved this interview, this podcast. Tim Ingham, I rave about him almost every week. It's just one of my favorite podcasts, and he's just such a great source of not only news about the music industry, but commentary about the music industry. Mm-hmm. And just so you know who Amy is, as Mike pointed out, she's the chief catalog officer at Hypnosis. But prior to joining Hypnosis, she ran her own artist management company, ATM Artists, and they represented acts like Seal, DJ Snake, Swedish House Mafia. She actually took Swedish House Mafia from being a baby band to one of the biggest EDM bands on the planet in the early 2010s, and she's also worked with Kanye West. Just to give you a little context on who Amy is.
Yes. And on that podcast, she talked about the 3 areas of the music business she believes needed drastic change. The first one, number 1, is NDAs, which, of course, as everyone listening probably knows, is a non-disclosure agreement. And she's talking about the non-disclosure agreements in the streaming payment terms of artist and songwriters' contracts. And I haven't thought about that, to be honest, but you would, and I'll let you share your story that we were talking about before, and you've seen some of these.
Well, yeah.
And a couple of things are kind of interesting about what an artist actually sees, like when it comes to Spotify and the different plans. I'll let you finish that story.
Yeah, and if you listen to Amy explains it much better than I could, but basically that DSP streaming rates are under NDA, non-disclosure agreements, right? So we don't really know exactly what is being paid. And it's so complicated. If you've ever seen some of these statements, there are so many line items. It's not as simple as it was 20 years ago, where there's just, sales on different configurations. She points out that there's 31 line items, 31 plans on Spotify alone. That's crazy, but if you get the statement, there are only 4. So there's kind of a disconnect there. She points out in the interview that we need one database of all songs, and I couldn't agree with her more. Right now, as you probably know, there's an ISRC code, and that's a unique code for every song, right? But there's also an ISWC, which is really on the publishing side, the writer side, and that doesn't get a lot of attention. Writers send in their splits, right? So there's no ISWC codes that are ingested into DSPs. So DSPs create this monthly report to the PROs, performing rights organizations, CSAC, ASCAP, those kinds of things. And then the PROs match those codes. But here's the thing that jumps out at me. And the one thing, if you take away one thing from this, is that 35% of the song codes are not matched. 35%.
Unbelievable. Unbelievable.
And she points out that this is the only industry on the planet that profits from bad data. We're talking about copyright law, which is from automated piano rolls in the 1800s, yes. And she's just calling for some change. And this ties in beautifully to our conversation with Merck. This ties beautifully into all of our conversations about the Copyright Royalty Board. This is all part of the mix. But you had touched on, there's 3 things here, right? You had touched on NDAs. What were the other 2?
The other 2, so number 1 is NDAs. Number 2 is data. And she says, as in the flow of data to music makers and the vast inefficiencies that bad data is causing. And then the number 3 is service and royalties, particularly the level of service that catalog artists are receiving from labels, despite their records all being available at the click of a button on Spotify and all the rest. So those are the 3 things that she is saying needs drastic change. But I got to tell you that the whole thing about ISRCs, which of course is what is that? It's the International what does the ISRC mean? International Recording Copyright ISRC. Anyway, what a code or whatever it is. I've uploaded a zillion tracks to a DSP. Never once have I ever heard that those existed.
Yeah, ISRC is International Standard Recording Code.
There you go.
And
yes.
Here's the thing. There's one for every song. So if you and I record a song, there's an ISRC code. But if there's a remix of that song or a live version of that song, that's a different ISRC code. It's a unique identifier. Now, the data, you and I hear this all the time, that there's 60,000 tracks uploaded every day to Spotify, whatever. Well, that's not really entirely accurate. The number I can tell you, and it gets a little muddy, but stay with me here. The number of ISRCs uploaded to the DSPs in 2021, that was about 29 million different ISRCs. So there's one for the video, there's one for the remix, whatever. So that's not songs. There's not, 29 million songs. There's 29 ISRCs, and that comes to 79,000 a day. So when you hear, there's 60,000 uploaded every day, well, is that unique songs without videos? Yes. Is that including videos? Is that different versions? I think that 60,000 was ISRCs, and now that's grown to 79,000. But, we're talking about catalog. Catalog's a majority of our business, right? You and I talked about last week, what is catalog? It's something that's 18 months or older. And I would argue that that's not catalog. It should be based on velocity, but we won't go down that rabbit hole. But, since 2006, that's right around when streaming started, she points out that most labels haven't heard from, most artists haven't heard from their labels since 2006, and if we're doing so much business on catalog and you're giving up so much revenue to these labels and distributors, that's the challenge, because everybody's focused on the hot new releases that are streaming. But I don't know if you follow Glenn Peoples from Billboard. We talk about him a lot. He's a dear friend and just a great guy. But he has a weekly newsletter called The Ledger. And not this week, but last week, he had this really cool chart. And one of the things I grabbed from it was that it's 0.88. It's less than 1% of music released in the last year has had 1 million streams. Less than 1%. So we're focusing on all these big hit things, Billie Eilish, Doja Cat, Megan Thee Stallion, all this, this stuff. But really, if you look at all the music that's being released, there's this gap, and primarily most of the revenue is coming from catalog.
Yeah, absolutely. She was mentioning also kind of calling for simplicity. She said Thomson also calls for simplicity in the way that artists and songwriters are accounted to by their labels and publishers, and expresses exasperation over the percentage of potential earnings that are taken from writers through the industry's international network of collection societies. Why does it take 18 months for revenue from a stream to come back to me? Because the PROs are now really controlling all streaming revenue on behalf of the writer, ? She asks. And that's the other thing that you forget is it's like it takes forever to get accounting on some of these things. And again, getting back to data. But I also wanted to mention a thing about, labels and artists or artists not having heard from their labels for a long time. Back when I was doing catalog at Capital, actually, I was stunned at that time especially when you have these heritage artists, how hard it is to stay in touch with them because they have changing managers, changing business managers.
They might move, might be a different address or different email address or different phone number. Yeah.
Not that they should have enough people to kind of deal with this, but it is really hard. And I don't know if you've, I also kind of manage a catalog and suddenly you'll be sending out royalty checks and then suddenly they just get returned.
Yeah.
People move and they don't leave forwarding addresses, and then you've got to track them down. It is really amazing how, when you talk to people that work in royalties departments, how hard it is, especially the further back it goes for artists. Yeah. And then when artists die, how those things transfer. So I do want to say that is a real issue at the moment, and I've dealt with it personally.
I think that the blockchain technology is amazing, and I think that will eventually help that trackability, traceability. But one of the things that she talks about is, some of these catalog groups, and you and I have worked for catalog groups. I worked for Universal Music Enterprises. I've worked with Rhino, worked with those people are very aggressive, very smart people working catalog, doing creative things. Music Ally does these recaps of some of these marketing campaigns. They did one on Def Leppard recently that was really interesting that you should check out. But she points out something that I hadn't really thought of, because we're so aggressive with catalog, at least, when I was with those companies, but that record deals don't cover services from record labels when it comes to catalog. Now think about that for a second. When you sign a record deal, you're talking about what the record label's roles and responsibilities are going to be to exploit that music and maybe to help with touring or radio or sync or whatever. But she's saying that in these agreements, and I think she's right, there really isn't much about, what are we going to do with, how are we going to drive more consumption of the catalog. And it's to their best interest to do that, but it's not always done. And sometimes something like that Dreams, Fleetwood Mac, TikTok moment will come out of nowhere. But I don't think that was contrived and created, by Warner Brothers, right? So that's an interesting point, that catalog is, it's 2/3 of our business, but it's, it's not sexy. It's not something that is worked or at least exploited in the way that some of the new release stuff is.
Yeah, right. And it's she kind of compares this to or she talks about, other industries, and, so many things in the record business are so opaque and it wouldn't be tolerated in other industries.
No way.
No way.
No.
And so, we've got a long way to go to be more transparent,
Yeah.
to really kind of, and again, Merck talked about that when we chatted him up, and talked about how, this is still in many ways a very unsophisticated business, this music business. And I think she kind of is talking with a little bit more specificity about just that very thing, that, there's a lot of these stuff that just would not be tolerated.
No.
It's just like, what?
No,
What are you
especially
talking about?
today in a digital world, we know the flow of consumption and revenue and all of that. And eventually, I believe, because I'm seeing signs of this, we are going to get to a place where there's this great transparency. And some of the indie artists have so much more transparency based on these platforms that they're using. They know about merch sales and venue sales and, touring revenue, just everything. They're getting like basically almost real-time data on what is happening with their career. And there's some platforms out there, some really great platforms that are doing that. I think eventually that's going to come to the major label ecosystem and the major indies. So, I think some of this is by design. The complexities of the music industry, how unsophisticated it is, I think is by design. But man, I mean, those two podcasts that we just talked about, the one with Will Page and then this one where Tim Ingham interviews Amy Thomson, absolutely amazing. Take the time out of your day to listen to those, on your morning walk or when you're working out or making dinner or commute, whatever, because there's so much great information. And I really think you'll have an epiphany or two listening to this.
Absolutely. And let's just jump into our last story, Jay. Also from Trapital, why your followers aren't fans of your music. And it's kind of a counterintuitive, but as Dan explains, it starts to make a lot more sense. So it's
we should pay him, or send him some cookies or flowers or something for giving us 2/3 of our show today.
Yeah,
thank you, Dan.
Absolutely, thank you, Dan. We do appreciate it.
But
sure,
he kind of kicks it off with that coil array. He says that a coil array has all the cosigns that a rising artist dreams of. Right, signed to Republic Records. Songs with
Check.
Nicki Minaj, Lil Durk.
Check.
Yeah, performed on The Tonight Show with Jimmy Fallon, nominated for BET Award, over 6 million Instagram followers. Okay, so when artists talk about the machine behind them, this is what they mean. The only thing missing here is a Coachella guest appearance and a British Vogue magazine. So last week, Laray's debut album, Trendsetter, sold just 11,500 album units. And that's, around 17 million streams. That's less streams last week than Fleetwood Mac's Rumors, an album that came out 45 years ago. Okay.
Yeah.
Laray's numbers may not be eye-popping, but hardly a surprise. Artists hear the same rhetoric often. Build your social media following. Build your social media following. Use it to promote your work. Be your own distribution. But that's reductive. Your followers aren't necessarily fans of your music.
Right. And he says not all followers are the same. On most social media networks, it's impossible to segment your followers into different categories. Are your fans there because they love your music or because they like you as a person, or do they find your posts entertaining? Do they follow you because they find you attractive, or do they love the shade room worthy posts you share and don't want to miss the tea? For some artists, it's all of those combined, but most of the time it's not. As he said, the two most followed rappers on Instagram are Nicki Minaj and Cardi B. They use their platforms effectively, but they are a reminder of why this follower-fan dynamic is often tougher for women in hip-hop, even the superstars. He said in this case that the industry pushes them to be sex symbols, to be marketable, yet this increases the likelihood that many of their followers are just there to double tap on attractive photos. The social media algorithm will push that artist's content to most users who live for those photos. The narrative that women in hip hop it's
easy for you to say.
That's easy for me to say. The narrative that women in hip hop have to work twice as hard as numbers to back it up.
Yeah.
But so he's talking about, again, why are people following you? It may be because of your music, but it just as easily could be about your looks.
Oh, I'm telling you right now, that is absolutely true. That is absolutely true. That I have artists that have massive followings on certain platforms because of their appearance, and people follow them, comment on them. But it's so challenging to get a fan that is finding you attractive to actually go and stream your music or see your live show or buy merch. Just because you have a big social footprint, that doesn't always equate to butts in the seats. It doesn't always equate to streaming. And I've seen this over and over again. Sometimes it does, but conversely, I've seen artists with small social footprints that are filling up halls because maybe they're a little bit older and, their fans aren't really on TikTok. They're not really on Instagram like maybe some of the younger folks are. And they talk a little bit about, how you need to match the platform with a clear call to action. And we hear that a lot. A lot of artist managers will say, I like the call to action of subscribe to my YouTube channel and follow me on Spotify. And the reason they cherry pick those two is because there's a clear result. If you subscribe to somebody's YouTube channel, then you're notified when they have new music, new videos coming out, which is valuable, right? They let them know. And then also on Spotify, your music, let's say, I sign up for, to follow somebody on Spotify. The next time they release a track, it's dropped into my release radar or Discover Weekly or radio or whatever. And a lot of spins come from those sources. So that call to action, he used an example, about this company that does text marketing, in the past, like Superphone. That was
Superphone.
Yeah, it was founder Ryan Leslie, and he talks about this game plan he had that he already understood what he calls the pyramid of intimacy. He knew exactly how to use his service. Here's what he said in a 2020 interview. The difference between my 2013 campaign and the campaigns I'm seeing now is that there's a very specific intent captured at the initiation. So I didn't just say, hey, here's my number, shoot me a text, what's up? I said, look, shoot me a text to get my new album. So if they shoot me a text, I already know the reason. And for that, the intent led to 50% conversion rate. 17,000 of the 35,000 people who signed up for his email list bought the album. That's incredible. And that was $170,000 in revenue.
Right. But then he also used that to follow up and sell tickets for a concert. So he sold 40,000 tickets at 60 euros, which led to 2.4 million euros. So what a difference again, when you talk about sometimes the difference in why artists are so focused on live performance.
Yeah.
Of course, that
revenue,
170,000. Yeah, the revenue, the dramatically difference. But again, what a clever way of recognizing and setting up your fan engagement with a lot more specificity with which to sort of gauge its effectiveness, and also the intent is very clear.
Yes.
What he's doing.
Yeah, and
which is very important.
it's just so important, and I say this almost every day. That your followers aren't necessarily fans of your music. They could be, and they should be, and you need to engage them. But if there's one part of this, we'll kind of end on, is that it's something I literally say every day. You know, your social post can't be buy my album, see my show, buy my album, see my show. There's got to be a relationship. There's got to be a dialogue. There's got to be something deeper than just shouting at somebody to buy your product. And Dan points out that every post can't be album out now, stream my music. But the more value you offer that's in line with why people follow you, the higher percentage who will convert to true fans, listeners, concert attendees, or customers. Amen.
Bingo, 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 bingo. But if you've got 50,000 followers, you're not going to sell 50,000 albums necessarily. I mean, that's just not the way it works. And it's something to think about. And again, it's the challenge that I'm sure you face every day, which is, you know, kind of managing expectations with artists, you know, getting them to do the right things, but also managing expectations with what comes back.
There's audience and then there's engagement. And
absolutely,
that's the challenge of the new music business. Great job on these pieces, Dan.
Oh my gosh.
Much respect. Stories. I love Trapital. I read as much of what Dan produces as possible, and I encourage our readers to subscribe to his newsletter at Trapital.co. It's Trapital, Trapital.co. Sign up for his newsletter. You'll thank me later.
It's worth your time.
Yeah.
It is worth your time. Absolutely. So as we wrap up this episode, Jay, it is the end of episode number 89. I do want to thank our sponsors, including the Music Business Association, Hypebot, and Bandsintown. For crying out loud, we really, really, really appreciate it. And Jay, what do you say we start the rest of our weekend? And thanks for everyone for listening in. We'll see you next week on episode 90. This has been the Your Morning Coffee Podcast. We'll see you next time.
You've been listening to Your Morning Coffee, the weekly music news program for the new music business. Join Jay Gilbert and Mike Etchart next time for the digital music news you need to know.